Of course, during the Clinton years, we waived EMP hardening on essentially all of our new weapon systems because it cost a bit more to buy a system with EMP hardening, and we could buy a few more systems, and we had some cuts in the military then, and so they just waived EMP hardening. I really cannot remember where I first heard about EMP, but soon after I heard about it, I called my friend Tom Clancy, who has done some fundraisers for me, and I knew he did good research, and he had an EMP scenario in one of his books, and I asked him to chat with me about EMP. He said, if you read my book, you know all I know. And if you want to know more, why don't you call the smartest man hired by the U.S. government? And in his view, that was a Dr. Lowell Wood from Lawrence Livermore. This was pre-cell phone days. And so I remember the old pagers we had. And so I paged and up to the satellite and down, and I thought I was paging somebody in California. As it turned out, he was in Washington. Within an hour, he was sitting at my desk. So we come to the time when two-thirds of the members of the Armed Services Committee had never heard of EMP, to a time when we have a permanent task force set up in DOD and a big group of people like this coming to talk about it. And I was very encouraged with the number of you that are here because you're from a congressman or a congresswoman's office. Hi, Frank. Hi, hi. Hi. So I'm really encouraged. Something happened yesterday that Lisa was telling me about on the way over in San Francisco, where apparently something done by one technician, and I'm sorry, San Diego, and all of San Diego is without electricity for several hours. It came back on. Of course, if it is really an EMP attack, it's not going to come back on. And we were also, by we, the military, were also without electricity, I understand, in San Diego. Is that correct? For several decades now, we have been in our military facilities doing exactly the wrong thing. We have been divesting ourselves of all of our infrastructure. Somebody else now provides our water, somebody else provides our electricity, somebody else treats our sewage. We are totally dependent on the community for services in our military. I've been trying for a long while to encourage our military to island themselves so that they could be self-sufficient in the event of a disaster. If the grid goes down, even if the major transformers are not damaged, and they probably would be, but in the event that you might restart the grid, some of the grid cannot do a black start. It has to have electricity to do a start. So if our bases, and they're scattered broadly over the country, if our bases were island and they had their own power, and I'm encouraging them to make that power a small modular nuclear reactor. Diesel is not going to do it. For any protracted period of time, you're just not going to have much diesel, even though you think that's a big diesel farm you have. It is not going to be enough. They need something which is really, really permanent. In the event of an attack like this, I would at least like to have a military that could semi-function, wouldn't you? And now we cannot, because almost on every one of our bases, our military is dependent on services from somebody else. We're having a tabletop exercise. October 3, we're talking about nuclear EMP. It's the National Defense University, Department of Homeland Security, and a somewhat reluctant Department of Energy. On October 3, it'll be a private one. This is not open to the public. Tabletop exercise on nuclear EMP. On the 4th and 5th, it will be solar EMP. You know, there may not be a nuclear EMP. I think the likelihood that there will be one is very high because your very vulnerability invites attack. And we couldn't really be more vulnerable. But there's an absolute certainty that there will be a solar EMP. It isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. The last major one occurred in 1859. We're way overdue. It's called a Carrington event. You may be familiar with it. Dr. Carrington described it. It set fire to things when all we had was the old Morse code switches, and it set fire to things. This would be devastating in our economy today. I'm forgetting his name now, top person for this in FERC was in my office. And I asked him what would happen in the event that we had an attack like that now, a solar flare like that. Now, he said the grid would be down for 2 years or so. Wow, what would be the consequence of that? Well, he said probably 2/3 of our people will die, and that may be an optimistic evaluation of what would happen in a situation like this. So I'm really encouraged that you're here. And how many of you represent a congressional office? I heard you. Wow, that's great. You know, get back to your member. Thank them very much for sending you here. The Pentagon believes that this is not going to happen because there's nobody who would be crazy enough to do this, and then we would simply vaporize them. But it's going to come from the ocean. There will be no fingerprints on it. There have been 2 books written on this subject. One of them, 1 Second After. Have you read 1 Second After? Okay, some of you need to read 1 Second After. And the other book was written by Dr. Lowry. Dr. Lowry was, and it's called The Satan Legacy. Dr. Lowry was recovering in a hospital room from open heart surgery, and he was surfing the television. And he came on C-SPAN, and I was doing one of my probably half-dozen hours on the floor talking about EMP. And he got, he'd never heard about EMP. And he got really interested in it, and he was retired, and he was a PhD electrical engineer, and he did a lot of research on EMP, and he wrote a book. I never thought I could read a 700-page novel. I don't read novels, but I did. It was really fascinating. The point I wanted to make was that in both of these books, the missile comes out of the ocean, and there are no fingerprints on it, which is why I'm somewhat amused by where we're putting our ballistic missile defense. In Alaska, who's coming over the pole? Russia's not coming, and if Russia came over the pole, it wouldn't matter. I mean, they would swamp our meager defenses very quickly over there. Be a long time before China has enough to come over the pole, and nobody else is going to launch from their soil. Why should they? These people may be evil. They're not idiots, are they? They're not going to launch from their own soil. They're going to launch from the ocean. And both of these books have it launched from the ocean. Really interesting in Dr. Lowry's book, The Satan Legacy. It's a SA-18, is that it? The big Russian missile with 10 warheads. They were in Ukraine, and when the Soviet Union fell apart, one of them didn't make it back to Russia, and it's gone, and there are 10 warheads, and 3 of them come out of the Gulf. And we see them coming up, and where are they going to land? Well, one's landing up in central Canada, and one out in the Pacific, one out in the Atlantic. Well, that's not what they're for. It must be EMP. Where are they? At Apogee. At Apogee, they're right across the country. Oh, this is an EMP attack. And so it follows 3 different scenarios. One in a New York family, one in a couple of families near St. Louis, and the third one is a White House and a Tom Clancy kind of international intrigue thing with the Russians. But the point I wanted to make was that in both of these books, I think they speak to the reality that we're going to have no idea who sponsors these attacks because they're going to come from the ocean with no fingerprints on them. If you lease a tramp steamer and you buy a Scud launcher, which costs $100,000, it's on the market today, and a crude nuclear weapon, that won't take out all of our country. But you can get 180 miles up, that will take out all of New England. That would be Katrina, at least 10 times over. And there would be no fingerprints on that. Now, what do you do? Who do you vaporize when you've seen that? You know, deterrence is not the best defense against this. It worked in the Cold War. This is not the Cold War. And there will be non-state actors. There are no non-state actors we had to be concerned about in the Cold War. This is a whole different world we're living in, and I'm not sure that our leadership in the Pentagon understands that. But I'm pleased that at least they have this permanent task force looking at it. And I hope that you can help here. My understanding is that what they are intending to protect against is something which is considerably less than I think what the real threat will be. The EMP Commission, which my legislation set up and it functioned for 8 years. That's a long time for a commission. Hard to keep them alive down here. They interviewed 2 Russian generals who said the Soviets had developed and they had weapons that produced 200 kilovolts per meter, enhanced EMP weapons. If that's true, and I have no reason to believe it's not true, that's 100 kilovolts per meter at the margin. That's at least double anything that I know that we've ever built to or tested to. And if that's the reality, and we're testing to something like 30 kilovolts per meter, then it may make little difference whether we've hardened or not, because it's not going to be hardened against the real threat. If we're going to do it, let's do it. and let's harden against a threat big enough so that we can be secure. Our very vulnerability invites attack, and the fact that this could be done by a non-state actor, and it can. And, you know, we're putting up that ballistic missile defense thing in Europe. They're not going to launch from Europe here toward us. There's a great big ocean out there. They're going to launch from a ship off our shore. You're not going to have a half hour's warning. You're going to have 5 minutes warning if you're lucky, right? You know, so we need to harden ourselves so that it won't matter whether they do it or not, because we're not going to be much injured by it. Now we'd be totally, totally devastated by it. And, you know, with that kind of a vulnerability, don't we just invite attack? Frank, thank you very much for inviting me.